The 1980s would see a transition to smaller front-wheel drive cars for both import and domestic brands. And while some American brands would see an increase in sales into the 1980s, Ford and Chevy would be nowhere near maintaining the levels they'd reached in the 70s. Chevrolet would start the decade continuing their high from the 70s, peaking at nearly 2.3 million in 1980, but sales would quickly fall in spite of, or possibly because of, a string of all-new award-winning models that included the Citation in 1980, with sales over 800,000 its first year, the Cavalier, with sales starting at 195,000, enough to easily outsell Toyota's Corolla in the U.S., the similar but slightly larger Celebrity, which only saw 90,000 in sales its first year, while being sold alongside the Malibu it was supposed to replace, that still sold 115,000. There was also the all-new Camaro for 1982, raising sales to 180,000 from 125,000 the previous year, and the first new Corvette in 15 years, doubling sales from the previous model to just over 50,000 after a one-year hiatus. Ford sales would decline for 1980 after taking control of the light truck market, which is not represented here, with the F-150 pickup in 1979. And then they would go on to take control of the U.S. market by the end of the decade with a string of hits, starting with the subcompact Escort World Car of 1981, with starting sales of 220,000, the aerodynamic Thunderbird in 1983, with sales starting at 122,000, the second World Car, the Tempo of 1984, with sales exceeding 400,000, or more than both the Accord and Camry combined at the time, and the Aero sedan mid-size Taurus, which debuted in 1986 with 235,000. Although once people got used to the Taurus's styling, sales would actually go up from there, and Ford sales would peak in 1988 at just over 1.3 million, a year that the primary introduction was just a facelifted Crown Victoria that would see more than 125,000 in sales that year. In 1985, Oldsmobile replaced the forgettable Omega with the Calais, a car with Junior Tornado styling and a Cadillac name that would soon become yet another Cutlass model as the Cutlass Calais, which would see first-year sales of 105,000, more than double what the previous model sold, helping Olds just edge out their previous sales record at nearly 1.2 million. The top-selling Cutlass Sierra sold around 300,000 at the time, while the more traditional rear-wheel drive Cutlasses sold about 220,000. But sales would decline significantly by the end of the decade. Buick was building a reputation for V6s, and a downsized Electra for 1985 had your choice of three of them, helping Buick also set a sales record that year of just over 1 million. But it was the turbo cars that were really getting people's attention. Attention, but not dollars. Of just over 140,000 Electras, less than 5,000 were turbocharged. Of 125,000 Regals, only around 4,000 were the Turbo T-Type or Grand National, and like Oldsmobile, sales would decline after mid-decade. Alternately, Pontiac would be down early in the decade, but promoting their performance image helped Pontiac sales climb above 800,000 by the end of the decade, mostly thanks to the Grand Am, which sold 245,000 in 1989, and the Grand Prix that sold 136,000, while the Firebird only managed 65,000 by this point. Recovering from hard financial times, with the aid of four-cylinder turbo cars and Shelby badging, Dodge was now aimed directly at Ford and Chevy in place of Plymouth, and sales would steadily creep up, hitting over 500,000 in car sales in 1987, and breaking into the top 5 for just a moment by pushing a sporty image with cars like the Daytona and Charger, which sold 32,000 and 26,000 respectively in 1987. but it was the budget-oriented Aries and Omni that remained the top sellers at $100,000 and $66,000. By the 1980s, Mercury was just a better equipped Ford with a different grille. Matching Ford model for model, they typically had a third of the sales that Ford did. The Capri started the decade at nearly $80,000. The Lynx had first-year sales of $112,000. The Cougar would peak in 1986 with $135,000, and the Sable would climb to $130,000 by the end of the decade. But sales would peak at $475,000 in 1984 with the introduction of the Topaz, which accounted for $125,000 of the total that year. At this point, Plymouth served no other purpose than to have entry-level cars at Chrysler dealerships, but many buyers still saw it as a mainstream brand. And after sales peaked at $440,000 in 1987, it would be all downhill from there. The new Sundance that year only saw $75,000 in first-year sales, while the Reliant it was supposed to replace sold over $100,000, and the even older Horizon sold $80,000. Chrysler's days as a luxury brand focused on big luxury cruisers seemed to be in question by 1985, as models became more mainstream and V8 rear-wheel drive cars were replaced by front-wheel drive four-cylinder turbo cars. But sales were climbing after an early decade low. The new Imperial personal luxury coupe of 1981 barely sold 10,000 units over the 3 years that it was offered, and the last remaining big car, the Fifth Avenue, remained their best seller at $110,000, while the new LeBaron GTS's $55,000 in sales was overshadowed by the barely disguised K-car-based LeBarons at $90,000. Cadillac remained the best-selling luxury brand in America by a large margin. In 1985, sales would come close to $385,000, and one might argue that they were becoming complacent with their new models. They certainly were not taking the imports too seriously. The Cimarron's $20,000 in sales that year was no threat to the BMW 3 Series at over $50,000 the same year, but the Seville's $40,000 in sales easily fended off the big Mercedes-Benzes, and the new DeVille, with $140,000 in sales, was far above both Mercedes and BMW in total U.S. sales. And the rear-wheel drive Fleetwood Brougham was still the traditional big car of choice, as well as the top choice for conversions, such as limousines, hearses, and ambulances, with production at approximately 55,000. But the dominance of American brands in the American market would soon be coming to an end. But we will look at that in another video. As always, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment below.